The massive ships hung in space like dark mountains blocking out the stars. 300 vessels from the Calrathian Empire surrounded Earth in a perfect formation that spoke of absolute military precision. Each ship was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and their weapons could turn entire cities to ash in seconds. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Vexner watched the blue planet below with the cold satisfaction of someone who had done this 73 times before. Every species eventually bent the knee. Every civilization chose survival over pride. The humans would be no different. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the shuttle bay of the Calrathian flagship and tried not to show fear. The interior of the alien ship was vast and dark with lighting that hurt human eyes. Everywhere he looked, there were soldiers in black armor carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. They had summoned him alone, and he had come because refusing would have meant immediate orbital bombardment. Earth's defense fleet of 47 ships waited below in tight formation, but everyone knew they were hopelessly outmatched. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a surrender ceremony that hadn't happened yet. 2 Calrathian guards led Jake through corridors that seemed to go on forever. The aliens were tall and thin with gray skin and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. They didn't speak to him or even look at him as they walked. To them, he was already a conquered subject, barely worth acknowledgement. After what felt like an hour, they reached a massive chamber where Admiral Vexnor waited on a raised platform. Behind him stood representatives from a dozen other alien species, all wearing the same defeated expression. All of them had chosen submission over extinction. Admiral Vexnor began speaking, and a translator device converted his words into English. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing something as simple as the weather. The Calrathian Empire had come to offer Earth a place in their civilization. Humanity would surrender all military vessels and weapons. They would provide yearly tribute of resources, including rare metals and food supplies. They would accept Calrathian governors on every continent. They would integrate into the Empire as a client species with limited rights and freedoms. In exchange, the Empire would not destroy Earth cities or kill billions of people. This was mercy by Calrathian standards. This was generosity. Jake listened to every word without interrupting. He looked at the conquered species standing behind the Admiral and saw the shame in their eyes. He wondered how long ago they had stood where he stood now and made the choice to live on their knees. Some of them had probably been powerful once with proud military traditions and dreams of exploring the stars. Now they were servants wearing the chains they had chosen for themselves. The translator fell silent, and Admiral Vexnor stared down at Jake with eyes that expected gratitude for offering slavery instead of death. Jake asked a single question. He wanted to know if the terms were negotiable, or if this was the only offer Earth would receive. Admiral Vexnor almost laughed. He explained that the Calrathian Empire did not negotiate with primitive species. They extended mercy when they chose and withdrew it just as easily. Humanity had 72 hours to accept these terms. If they refused, the Empire would begin orbital bombardment starting with Earth's largest cities. 10 million dead every hour until someone on that planet learned wisdom. The Admiral dismissed Jake with a wave of his hand as if he were swatting away an insect. The shuttle ride back to Earth gave Jake time to think. He looked out the window at the Calrathian fleet and did the calculations in his head. Even if every human ship fought to the last crew member, they might destroy 10 or 15 enemy vessels before being wiped out. It wouldn't even dent the Empire's forces. Any military advisor would say surrender was the only logical choice. Any sane leader would choose survival. But Jake kept thinking about the conquered species he had seen standing behind Admiral Vexnor. He wondered if they had thought the same thing. He wondered if they regretted their choice. President Helen Carter convened the Emergency Global Council in a bunker 3 miles beneath Colorado. Every nation had sent representatives, and every face showed the same sick fear. The room erupted into dozens of arguments the moment Jake finished his report. The delegate from Europe argued for immediate surrender, saying that slavery was better than extinction. The Asian coalition wanted to try negotiation and offer the Empire even more resources if they would grant humanity better terms. The African Union representative pointed out that their ancestors had survived slavery before, and they could do it again. Everyone had an opinion, and none of them were good. General Marcus Cole sat quietly through 2 hours of debate before he finally stood up. The room fell silent because everyone knew his reputation. He had spent 40 years studying military history and strategy. He had written the current Earth defense protocols. When he spoke, people listened even when they didn't want to hear what he had to say. He walked to the front of the room and brought up a holographic display showing Earth's industrial capacity. Then he asked a question that made everyone uncomfortable. What if they chose neither surrender nor negotiation? What if they chose war? The room exploded again, but this time with anger instead of fear. People called him insane and suicidal. They threw statistics at him about the enemy's superior numbers and technology. They talked about the billions who would die in the first week of fighting. General Cole let them yell themselves hoarse before he spoke again. He agreed with everything they said. Earth would lose. Billions would die. The planet might be left uninhabitable. But then he showed them something else. He showed them production numbers from human history during total war. He showed them what humanity accomplished when every factory and every resource was devoted to a single purpose. During World War II, Earth produced hundreds of thousands of aircraft and tanks in just 4 years. They did it with technology that was primitive compared to what existed now. General Cole explained that modern automation and fabrication meant they could build ships faster than any empire that relied on traditional shipyards. The ships wouldn't be pretty or sophisticated, but they would be numerous. The Calrathians fought clean, efficient wars. Humanity could fight dirty. They could fight asymmetric. They could make every victory cost the empire more than it gained. They couldn't win, but they could make winning so expensive that the empire would wish they had never come to Earth. President. Carter looked around the room at representatives. From every nation on Earth, she saw fear and doubt, but also something else. She saw anger starting to replace despair. She asked for a vote. Surrender, negotiate, or fight. The vote took 3 hours and the arguments never stopped, but eventually a decision was made. Jake Morrison would return to the Calrathian flagship. He would deliver humanity's answer. The answer that would change everything. Jake spent the next day preparing with Lieutenant Amy Brooks and Dr. Nathan Cross. Amy was Earth's most decorated pilot with more combat hours than anyone else in the fleet. Nathan was a historian who had spent his life studying human conflict. Together, they would present Earth's response to Admiral Vexenor. They gathered data and recordings and historical documents. They built a presentation that explained humanity in ways the Calrathians had never bothered to learn. When they were ready, Jake looked at his team and wondered if they would survive the next 24 hours. Then he stopped wondering and focused on the job. They had a message to deliver. Whether the Empire listened or not was up to them. Admiral Vexenor transmitted his report to the Calrathian throne world while his fleet maintained position around Earth. The message traveled through quantum relays across dozens of light years and reached the Imperial Palace within hours. Empress Dalshara reviewed the report in her private chambers surrounded by her war council. The human response was unprecedented in the Empire's history. No species had ever delivered what amounted to a threat instead of surrender terms. The Empress called for a full council meeting to discuss how to respond to this peculiar situation. Lords and military commanders gathered in the Grand Hall where decisions about the fate of worlds were made with casual efficiency. Lord Commander Zethmar was the first to speak after the Empress finished reading Vexenor's report aloud. He was the oldest member of the War Council and had overseen the conquest of 40 systems during his career. His initial reaction was dismissive. He called the human response primitive bluster, from a species too ignorant to understand their situation. Several other lords agreed loudly. They argued that humanity needed to be taught a lesson about defying the Empire. Some suggested immediate orbital bombardment. Others recommended capturing Earth's leaders and executing them publicly as an example. The consensus in the room was that force should be met with overwhelming force. The humans would learn wisdom through pain, but Empress Dalshara was more cautious than her advisors. She ordered Lord Commander Zethmar to conduct a thorough analysis of Earth's military history before making any final decisions. She wanted to know if the human claims about their warfare capabilities were accurate or exaggerated. Zethmar accepted the assignment with obvious reluctance. He considered it a waste of time, but the Empress had given a direct order. He retreated to the military archives with a team of analysts and began reviewing the data that Dr. Cross had presented. What he discovered over the next 3 days changed his entire perspective on the human situation. The historical records were worse than anything Zethmar had imagined. Human warfare was not just frequent but pathologically persistent. He found conflicts that lasted decades over territory no larger than a single city. He found wars fought over religious interpretations and political philosophies. He found examples of humans fighting to the last soldier defending positions that had no strategic value. The casualty numbers were staggering not because humans were weak, but because they kept fighting long past the point where any rational species would have negotiated peace. One statistic particularly disturbed him. During their Second World War, humanity lost approximately 3,000 people every single day for 6 years. They absorbed those losses and kept fighting. What truly alarmed Lord Commander Zethmar was not the history but the industrial capacity. He pulled up economic data from Earth during their major wars and ran calculations that made him call emergency meetings with his staff. During World War II, the United States alone produced 300,000 aircraft in 4 years. They built nearly 90,000 tanks. They launched thousands of ships. They did all of this while maintaining a civilian economy and feeding a population of over 100 million. The numbers seemed impossible until Zethmar compared them to Calrathian production rates. The Empire built approximately 20 capital ships per year across all their shipyards. They considered this efficient and sufficient because their enemies always surrendered quickly. Zethmar ran projections based on Earth's current industrial technology. Modern automation and fabrication techniques were far beyond what humans possessed during their primitive wars. If Earth converted its entire economy to military production, the way they had done historically, the results would be catastrophic for any prolonged conflict. His analysts estimated that humans could potentially produce 200 ships per month using modular construction. The ships would be crude and probably inferior to Calrathian vessels in direct combat. But numbers had a quality all their own. The Empire's entire fleet numbered approximately 800 ships spread across 73 conquered systems. If humans could actually achieve those production rates, they would match the Empire's total strength in 4 months. Meanwhile, on Earth, General Marcus Cole had already begun implementing what he called Protocol Hellstorm. Every major corporation had been contacted and given conversion orders. Civilian shipyards were being retooled for military production. Automotive factories were preparing to build armored vehicles. Electronics manufacturers were switching to weapon systems. The global economy was being transformed into a war machine. Cole knew they couldn't match Calrathian technology, but they could overwhelm it with quantity. He had studied every asymmetric conflict in human history and extracted the lessons that mattered. Guerrilla forces defeated occupying armies. Small, fast attacks bled larger forces. Willingness to accept casualties often mattered more than equipment quality. Lieutenant Lisa Grant was overseeing the construction of Earth's newest carrier at a facility that had been building commercial transports 3 weeks earlier. The ship was designated EDS Defiance, and it represented a completely new approach to spacecraft construction. Instead of the careful precision engineering that took years, the humans were using modular assembly. Major sections were built simultaneously at different locations, then joined together in orbit. The design sacrificed elegance and redundancy for speed. A traditional Earth carrier took 2 years to build. The Defiance would launch in 4 months. It wouldn't be as sophisticated as Calrathian vessels, but it would carry fighters and missiles. More importantly, it would be the first of dozens. Admiral Vexnor watched all of this activity from his flagship in orbit. He had expected Earth to spend these days in panicked negotiations or preparing for evacuation. Instead, every continent blazed with light 24 hours a day. Factories that had been dark were now running constant shifts. Launch facilities were expanding. Supply chains were being reorganized with military precision. The humans were not preparing to surrender or even to defend. They were preparing to attack. Vexnor sent daily reports to the throne world describing what he was observing. Each report was more concerned than the last. The humans were behaving exactly as they had warned they would. Lord Commander Zethmar presented his findings to the War Council 1 week after receiving his assignment. The mood in the chamber was different now. The easy confidence from the first meeting had been replaced by uncertainty. Zethmar displayed his analysis showing human industrial capacity and production projections. He showed casualty tolerance levels that made Calrathian generals uncomfortable. He explained that human military doctrine did not include provisions for surrender or retreat in most scenarios. Their soldiers were trained and culturally conditioned to fight until victory or death. This was not bravado. It was documented behavior spanning thousands of years. The War Council debated for hours. Some lords still insisted that superior Calrathian technology would prevail regardless of numbers. Others pointed out that the Empire had never fought a prolonged war. Their conquests were swift and decisive because conquered species recognized when they were beaten. Lord Zethmar argued that humans did not think like other species. They fought wars of attrition that would drain Imperial resources. They would use tactics the Calrathians considered dishonorable. They would target civilian infrastructure and supply lines, and most importantly, they would teach these tactics to every conquered species in the Empire. The risk was not just losing to Earth. The risk was that Earth would inspire rebellions across dozens of systems. Empress Dalshara listened to all arguments before making her decision. She was a pragmatic ruler who had maintained the Empire through careful calculation, rather than reckless aggression. She asked Zethmar a direct question. Could the Empire defeat Earth militarily? Zethmar answered honestly. Yes, the Empire could destroy Earth. They had the firepower and the ships. But the cost would be significant. They would lose ships and soldiers. They would expend resources that would leave them vulnerable elsewhere. And the victory would not end the war. Human survivors would scatter to other systems and continue fighting. The conflict could last years or even decades. The Empress asked a second question. What would happen if they simply withdrew without fighting? Several lords protested immediately. They argued that retreat would show weakness. Other species would question the Empire's power. Rebellions might spread, but Zethmar offered a different perspective. The Empire could frame withdrawal as mercy. They could claim they chose not to exterminate a primitive but spirited species. They could maintain their reputation while avoiding a costly war. More importantly, they could watch Earth from a distance and learn from this experience. The humans had revealed something important about warfare that the Empire had forgotten during centuries of easy victories. Some enemies cost more to defeat than they are worth. The War Council voted after 3 more hours of debate. The decision was not unanimous, but it was clear. The Calrathian Empire would teach humanity a lesson, but not the lesson Earth expected. They would demonstrate their military superiority through a single overwhelming strike. They would destroy the Mars colony completely as a warning of what defiance cost. Then they would offer Earth one final chance to surrender under the original terms. If the humans still refused, only then would the Empire commit to total war. This compromise satisfied the hawks who wanted blood and the pragmatists who worried about costs. Admiral Vexnor received his orders and began preparing his fleet for the assault on Mars. On Mars, Commander Ryan Pierce gathered his defense force and prepared for the battle everyone knew was coming. He had only 15 ships under his command, and the colony's population was barely 200,000. He received a transmission from Earth with General Cole's final orders. Hold as long as possible. Make them pay for every meter. Show the Empire what human defenders could do when they had no retreat and no surrender. Pierce assembled his captains and explained the situation bluntly. They were all going to die. The question was how many Calrathian ships they could take with them. Every captain volunteered to stay. Every crew member refused evacuation. They were about to give the Calrathian Empire its first taste of human warfare, and they intended to make it memorable. The Calrathian fleet arrived at Mars with 50 ships designated for the assault. Admiral Vexnor had chosen this number carefully to demonstrate overwhelming force while keeping most of his fleet at Earth. The attack was meant to be a demonstration, not a real battle. Mars colony would be destroyed in hours, and the survivors would broadcast images of the devastation back to Earth. Then humanity would understand the price of defiance. The Calrathian ships moved into assault formation and began scanning for defensive positions. What they found surprised them. The human ships were not hiding behind Mars or attempting to flee. They were arranged in a loose formation directly between the Calrathian fleet and the colony. 15 small vessels facing 50 larger ones with no attempt at tactical positioning. Commander Ryan Pierce stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the enemy approach. His ship was called the Mars Defender, and it had been a cargo hauler before the war. Now it carried missiles and railguns bolted to its hull in configurations that would horrify any proper engineer. Every ship in his small fleet was the same. Civilian vessels converted for combat with weapons mounted wherever they would fit. They were slow and clumsy compared to purpose-built warships. But they were here, and they were crewed by people who had already made peace with dying. Pierce opened a channel to all his ships and kept his message short. Make every shot count. Ram them if you run out of ammunition. Show these aliens what humans do when cornered. The Calrathian fleet opened fire at maximum range, expecting the human ships to scatter or attempt evasive maneuvers. Instead, the human vessels accelerated directly toward the incoming fire. It was suicide tactics that made no sense to the Calrathian commanders. 2 human ships exploded in the opening salvo. A third lost its engines and began tumbling through space. But the remaining 12 kept coming while firing everything they had. Their weapons were primitive compared to Calrathian technology, but there were a lot of them. Missiles streaked across the gap, followed by railgun rounds that moved at relativistic speeds. The Calrathian shields absorbed most of the damage, but not all of it. One frigate took a direct hit from 3 missiles simultaneously, and its shields collapsed. Captain Laura Manning commanded a destroyer that had been a mining ship 6 months earlier. Her crew consisted of former miners and dock workers who had volunteered when the call went out for defenders. She watched her tactical display as 2 more human ships died. The odds were impossible, but she had not expected to survive this day anyway. She lined up her approach on a Calrathian battlecruiser and gave her crew 5 minutes to reach the escape pods. Most of her people evacuated, but 6 stayed at their posts. They had all agreed they would see this through together. Manning pushed her engines to maximum burn and aimed her ship directly at the enemy battlecruiser. The Calrathians realized her intention too late. They tried to target her ship, but she was already inside their optimal firing range and moving too fast. The collision was devastating. Manning's destroyer hit the Calrathian battlecruiser at full speed with her remaining missiles set to detonate on impact. The explosion tore both ships apart and sent debris flying in every direction. The Calrathian fleet hesitated for the first time. Intentional collision was not part of their tactical doctrine. It was wasteful and inefficient. But the humans did it anyway. Before the Calrathian commanders could adapt, 4 more human ships followed Manning's example. They targeted different vessels and rammed them at maximum speed. 2 Calrathian ships were destroyed outright. 3 more were damaged badly enough to withdraw from the battle. The exchange rate was terrible for the humans, but they were achieving their objective. They were making the Calrathians pay. Commander Pierce watched his fleet die around him, but he also watched the enemy formation break apart. The Calrathians were pulling back to reassess. They had expected a quick victory, and instead they were taking casualties that shocked them. Pierce opened fire with everything his ship had left. His crew worked with desperate efficiency, loading missiles and firing railguns as fast as the weapons would cycle. They scored hits on 2 more enemy vessels before the Calrathian return fire found them. Pierce's ship began breaking apart, but he stayed at his post giving orders until the bridge lost atmosphere. The Mars Defender exploded 3 minutes later, taking the last human ship with it. The battle for Mars lasted only 40 minutes, but the results echoed across the solar system. The Calrathian fleet had won completely. All 15 human ships were destroyed. Mars' colony was bombarded until nothing remained but craters. But the victory cost Admiral Vexnor 7 ships destroyed and 11 damaged. He had started the battle with 50 vessels and ended with only 32 combat ready. The casualty rate among Calrathian crews was higher than any battle in the last century. And the humans had fought with converted civilian ships crewed by volunteers. Vexnor filed his report and tried to explain how 15 primitive vessels had inflicted such damage. His explanation sounded weak even to himself. On Earth, the news of Mars spread within hours. General Cole broadcast the battle footage to every military base and training facility. He wanted every soldier and pilot to see what Commander Pierce and his people had accomplished. The reaction was not grief or despair. It was rage mixed with pride. The defenders of Mars had bought time with their lives. They had shown that humans could hurt the Empire. Now it was time to show what Earth could do with preparation. Production facilities doubled their shifts. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers. The planet unified in a way it never had before. They had been given a demonstration of Calrathian power. Now they would demonstrate human determination. Lieutenant Amy Brooks led the first counterstrike 3 days after Mars fell. She commanded a squadron of 12 fast attack craft that had been built in the frantic weeks since the ultimatum. Her target was the Calrathian supply depot orbiting Jupiter. The enemy had established the depot to stockpile fuel and ammunition for the fleet at Earth. It was defended by 6 frigates and considered secure. Amy's plan was simple. Use Jupiter's radiation belts to mask their approach. Hit the depot with everything they had. Escape before reinforcements arrived. It was a classic raid strategy pulled from human military history and adapted for space combat. The attack began at dawn Earth time. Amy's squadron emerged from Jupiter's shadow, moving at maximum speed. The Calrathian defenders detected them immediately, but the humans were already launching missiles. Dozens of warheads streaked toward the supply depot while the attack craft scattered to avoid return fire. The Calrathians tried to intercept the missiles, but human electronic warfare systems jammed their targeting. Half the missiles got through. The supply depot exploded in a fireball that could be seen from Europa. Amy lost 2 pilots in the escape, but the mission accomplished its goal. The Calrathian fleet at Earth suddenly had limited fuel and ammunition. They would need to wait for resupply before launching any major operations. Admiral Vexnor realized he was no longer fighting a conventional war. The humans were not trying to win battles. They were trying to bleed his fleet through constant small attacks. Over the next week, human raiders hit 3 more supply convoys. They ambushed a repair ship heading to assist damaged vessels. They deployed mines in the approach vectors to Earth. Each attack was small and most were driven off or destroyed. But each attack cost the Calrathians ships and time and resources. Vexnor requested reinforcements from the throne world. He explained that Earth required a much larger fleet than initially projected. The response from Empress Dalshara was cold. Deal with the situation using available forces. Reinforcements would arrive in 6 months. The orbital factories around Earth began launching new ships at a rate that alarmed Calrathian intelligence. The vessels were crewed with armor bolted to civilian hulls and weapons mounted in improvised hardpoints. But they were numerous. Earth had lost 15 ships at Mars. 3 weeks later, they had 47 operational vessels. A month after that, they had 90. The quality was questionable, but the quantity was undeniable. General Cole was proving his point about industrial warfare. The humans could replace losses faster than the Calrathians could inflict them. And every new ship meant every new crew gaining combat experience. Captain Nick Foster commanded a frigate group assigned to harass Calrathian mining operations in the asteroid belt. His orders were simple: deny the enemy resources. He led his 6 ships on raids that destroyed mining equipment and ore processors. The Calrathians sent escorts to protect their operations, so Foster started targeting the escorts. His tactics were guerrilla warfare adapted for space. Strike fast and retreat before superior forces could respond. Never fight a battle you cannot win. Always make the enemy pay for every cubic meter of space. Foster lost 3 ships in 2 months, but his raids forced the Calrathians to divert 20 vessels to guard duty. 20 ships that could not attack Earth. Colonel Steve Murphy commanded the lunar defense platforms, and he introduced a new weapon that caught the Calrathians completely off guard. Humans had weaponized their own space debris. Earth orbit was full of defunct satellites and old equipment from centuries of space activity. Murphy's teams had spent weeks attaching small engines and guidance systems to this junk. Now they launched clouds of debris at Calrathian ships. The improvised weapons were slow and easy to detect, but there were thousands of them. Calrathian point defense systems were overwhelmed trying to shoot down garbage traveling at orbital velocities. Several ships took damage from impacts. One frigate lost its main engines when a dead satellite punched through its hull. 3 months into the war, Admiral Vexnor reviewed his situation and felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. He had started with 300 ships. Now he had 260 operational vessels. Earth had lost over 400 ships in the same time period. By any logical analysis, the Calrathians were winning. But Earth now had 300 new ships and more launching every week. The humans lost more battles and more people, but they kept coming. They fought with a persistence that wore down Calrathian crews. They used tactics that would be considered dishonorable in civilized warfare. They targeted supply lines and support vessels. They deployed weapons that barely worked but were too numerous to stop. And worst of all, they showed no sign of slowing down. Vexnor sent his final report of the quarter to Empress Dalshara. He detailed every battle and every loss. He explained that conventional military doctrine was failing against an enemy that did not follow conventional rules. He projected that at current rates, the Calrathian fleet would be reduced to ineffective strength within 6 months, while human numbers continued to grow. He made a recommendation that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. He suggested withdrawal or immediate reinforcement of at least 200 ships. The Empire could still win, but victory would require committing forces from other systems. It would leave the Empire vulnerable elsewhere, and even then the war might last years. The humans were not fighting to win. They were fighting to survive. And survival was a much more powerful motivation than conquest. 6 months into the war, the Calrathian Empire was bleeding from wounds it never expected to receive. Admiral Vexnor sat in his command chair and reviewed reports that all told the same story. Human raiders had struck another supply convoy near Saturn. A mining operation at Ceres had been destroyed. 3 escort frigates had been ambushed and damaged in the outer system. Every day brought new attacks, and every attack cost ships or resources or time. The Calrathians still won most engagements, but winning no longer meant what it used to mean. They destroyed human vessels, but more appeared to replace them. They killed human crews, but volunteers lined up to take their places. The war had become a nightmare of attrition that ground down everything it touched. Captain Nick Foster was leading another raid on Calrathian positions deep in the asteroid belt. His target was a mining facility that processed rare metals essential for ship construction. The facility was guarded by 8 Calrathian vessels, but Foster had learned how to fight smart instead of fighting fair. His 12 ships approached from multiple vectors using the asteroids for cover. They did not try to capture the facility or hold territory. They rigged the entire complex with explosives and retreated before enemy reinforcements arrived. The facility exploded in a chain reaction that destroyed months of mining work and denied the Empire crucial raw materials. Foster lost 1 ship in the operation but considered it an acceptable trade. On the Calrathian throne world, Empress Dalshara faced a crisis that threatened everything her ancestors had built. The war with Earth was supposed to last days. Instead, it had dragged on for half a year with no end in sight. The Imperial Treasury was being drained by constant ship construction and resource allocation. Even worse, the example of human resistance was inspiring rebellion across the Empire. 3 conquered species had launched uprisings in the past 2 months. They used tactics learned from watching how humans fought: guerrilla warfare and sabotage, and refusing to acknowledge defeat. The Calrathian military was now fighting on 7 different fronts and stretched dangerously thin. Lord Commander Zethmar delivered his strategic analysis to the War Council in a closed session. The numbers were devastating. The Empire had committed 400 ships to the Earth conflict over 6 months. Current operational strength was down to 220 vessels. Human losses were over 800 ships, but Earth now fielded 500 operational craft with more launching every week. The quality gap between Calrathian and human vessels was narrowing, as human engineers learned from every battle. More concerning was the psychological impact. Calrathian crews were exhausted from constant combat. Morale was declining. Soldiers questioned why they were fighting a war that seemed to have no victory condition. Zethmar presented evidence that made the War Council fall silent. Human scientists had developed biological agents, specifically designed to target Calrathian physiology. They had not deployed these weapons yet, but intelligence confirmed their existence. Human cyber warfare specialists had penetrated Imperial communication networks and were spreading propaganda to conquered species. The messages explained human resistance tactics and encouraged others to fight for freedom. Most alarming were reports of human operatives on 3 different conquered worlds. They were teaching insurgent groups how to build improvised weapons and conduct asymmetric warfare. Earth was not just fighting for itself anymore. It was trying to destabilize the entire Empire. Admiral Vexnor received unexpected orders from the throne world. He was to arrange a meeting with human leadership under temporary ceasefire conditions. The Empire wanted to explore options short of total war. Vexnor felt relief mixed with shame. Relief because the fighting could stop. Shame because this felt like admitting defeat to a primitive species. He sent the communication to Earth and waited for a response. It came within hours. Commander Jake Morrison would meet with him aboard a neutral station at the edge of human space. President Helen Carter had authorized negotiations but not surrender. The distinction was important. The meeting took place on a small commercial station that had been evacuated for the occasion. Jake Morrison arrived with a security detail but no weapons. He looked older than he had 6 months earlier. War aged everyone who lived through it. Admiral Vexnor met him in a conference room that felt too small for what they needed to discuss. The translator devices activated, and for a long moment neither spoke. They were 2 officers who had watched too many people die over territory and pride. Finally, Jake asked what the Empire wanted. Vexnor explained that Empress Dalshara was prepared to discuss terms for ending hostilities. Jake listened without interrupting as the Admiral outlined a proposal. The Calrathian Empire would withdraw from human space completely. They would recognize Earth's sovereignty over the solar system and a buffer zone extending 50 light-years in all directions. In exchange, humanity would cease all offensive operations immediately. There would be no reparations demanded by either side. No territory claimed, no prisoners held. Both sides would return to their borders and the war would end. Vexnor emphasized that this was a generous offer. The Empire could still win through overwhelming force if they committed their full military strength. But victory would cost more than it was worth. Jake considered the terms carefully before responding. He explained that Earth had not wanted this war. Humanity had tried to avoid conflict through honesty about what would happen if the Empire attacked. The Calrathians had chosen not to listen. Now millions were dead on both sides and vast resources had been destroyed. Earth was prepared to accept peace under the proposed terms with one additional condition. The Calrathian Empire would sign a non-aggression treaty with humanity that included technology exchange protocols. Not military technology, but medical and scientific knowledge that would benefit both civilizations. The Empire would also agree to stop expanding through conquest and instead pursue diplomatic relations with other species. Admiral Vexnor almost rejected the additional demands immediately. They went far beyond what the Empire had authorized him to discuss. But then he thought about the alternative. The war would continue for years. More ships would be lost. More rebellions would spread. The Empire might eventually win, but what would be left to rule? He agreed to present Earth's counter-proposal to Empress Dalshara with his personal recommendation for acceptance. Jake provided documentation outlining the full terms, and both officers parted without ceremony. They were not friends or allies. They were simply two people trying to end a war before it consumed everything. The response from the throne world came 2 days later. Empress Dalshara agreed to Earth's terms with some modifications to the technology exchange provisions. The Empire would not share advanced weapons technology, but would provide medical knowledge and basic science. In return, humans would share their industrial production techniques and resource management systems. Both sides would establish embassies and begin formal diplomatic relations. The war was over not with surrender but with mutual recognition that continuing to fight benefited no one. Admiral Vexnor broadcast the ceasefire order to all Calrathian forces in human space. The shooting stopped within hours. Lieutenant Amy Brooks led her squadron on one final mission. They escorted the Calrathian fleet to the border of human space not as a gesture of friendship, but as a message. Earth was watching and would always be ready. The Calrathian ships departed in formation, maintaining strict discipline even in retreat. Amy watched them cross the boundary line and felt something she had not felt in months. Hope that the killing was finally over. She turned her squadron back toward Earth and wondered what peace would feel like after living with war for so long. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the observation deck of Earth's new orbital defense station and looked out at the stars. Dr. Nathan Cross joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee that had probably been synthesized from recycled materials. They stood in silence for a while before Nathan spoke. He noted that humanity had changed the balance of power in the galaxy through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Other species would remember what happened when the Calrathian Empire tried to conquer Earth. The lesson would echo across centuries. Jake reflected on the cost of teaching that lesson. The official casualty count was 3 million dead, including everyone on Mars. Hundreds of ships destroyed. Resources that could have been used for exploration or development consumed by war. Earth's economy would take decades to fully recover. The psychological scars would last even longer. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had done it without surrendering their freedom. The price was terrible, but the alternative would have been worse. Living on your knees was not living at all. Admiral Vexnor submitted his final report to the Imperial War Archives. The document was classified at the highest level, but he knew it would eventually become required reading at military academies. He titled it carefully, "Why Superior Force is Not Enough: A Study of Human Warfare." The report detailed every mistake the Empire made. Underestimating enemy determination, failing to account for industrial capacity, assuming rational behavior from an enemy fighting for survival, not understanding that some species would rather die than submit. The lessons were expensive but necessary. The War Council on the Calrathian throne world debated the outcome for weeks after peace was declared. Some lords considered it humiliating that the Empire had backed down from a primitive species. Others argued it was pragmatic to end a war that could not be won at acceptable cost. Empress Dalshara made the final judgment. She declared that the Empire's expansion through conquest was over. Future growth would come through diplomacy and trade. The era of easy victories had ended, when the Calrathians met an enemy that fought like humans. Better to learn that lesson from one war than to lose everything trying to conquer species that would never surrender. On Earth, the rebuilding began immediately. President Helen Carter addressed the planet in a speech broadcast to every nation. She spoke about sacrifice and loss. She honored the dead who would never see the peace they fought to secure. She acknowledged that humanity had proven something to the galaxy, but also to themselves. When pushed to the edge, humans discovered strength they never knew they possessed. The war was over, but the memory would shape human civilization for generations. They had earned the right to exist on their own terms through blood and determination, and the refusal to accept slavery as survival. General Marcus Cole oversaw the conversion of military production back to civilian purposes. The factories that had built warships would now construct exploration vessels and colony ships. The weapons that had been developed would be studied and hopefully never used again. Cole knew that peace was fragile and that humanity needed to remain vigilant. But for now, the immediate threat was gone. Earth could breathe again. Young people could plan futures that did not involve dying in space. Parents could watch their children grow up. The simple blessings of peace felt precious after months of war. Years later, when historians studied the conflict, they struggled to find proper terminology. It was not a war in the traditional sense because Earth never tried to conquer Calrathian territory. It was not a rebellion because humanity had never been conquered. Eventually, they settled on calling it the Great Warning. The war where one species warned a galactic empire what would happen if they insisted on fighting. The Calrathians had been given clear notice about human nature. They had been shown historical evidence and cultural patterns. They had been told exactly what to expect, and they had chosen to ignore the warning because they believed in their own superiority. The galaxy learned from their mistake. Other aggressive species reconsidered their expansion plans when they looked at what happened to the mighty Calrathian Empire. Not defeated, but forced to retreat by a species that was willing to endure any cost to remain free, humanity became known not for their technology or their culture, but for their absolute unwillingness to surrender. It was a reputation that protected Earth better than any weapon or defense fleet, because every potential enemy had to ask themselves one question before attacking humans. Are we prepared for total war against an enemy that considers death preferable to defeat? The answer for most species was no, and so humanity was left alone to heal and grow and explore the stars on their own terms. The price had been terrible. The scars would last for generations, but they had proven something that would echo through galactic history. One human's words had sealed the Empire's fate not through threat but through truth. And the truth was simple. You can destroy humanity, but you cannot break it. And if you try, you will learn exactly why humans needed rules to limit how they fought each other.